Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. Today we're looking at the striking trend of big firms backing away from their commitments to diversity, equity and inclusion. DEI must die has become the mantra of the Trump government, and the president's new executive orders aim to dismantle nearly all forms of DEI. Although these are focused on the federal government, the orders impact private employers, especially those with government contracts. The move appears more generally to have hastened a swing away from DEI. McDonald's, Meta, Walmart, Google and Amazon are among those to abandon or water down their DEI commitments in recent weeks. So joining me to discuss the trend and what it means for the comms industry are Avril Lee, Head of Health and Wellness Europe at Zeno and Chair of the DEI Network at CIPR. Hi Avril, how are you?
Very well, thank you, John.
Good. And Zaiba Malik, Director of Coppergate Communications. Zaiba is a best-selling author, crisis communications consultant, media trainer and a former journalist who has worked for the likes of BBC News, Panorama, Channel 4 News and the Sunday Times. Hi Zaiba, how are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you. It's good to be here, John. Thank you for the invite.
Well, thank you for coming along. I think it's really important to discuss this topic. But before we get on to the main overview of DEI, Avril, we mentioned earlier on, you've been working on a DEI scheme in the comms industry, reverse mentoring. Just thought you could tell us a bit about that, how it works and who's been involved.
Thanks, John. It's a really amazing scheme. It's a reverse mentoring scheme that's been set up by the CIPR and Taylor Bennett Foundation. And it does what it says on the tin, as we say, because we are offering mentoring for senior leaders in comms by younger BME PR professionals in the UK. And we did that because we realised we were called out for senior leadership to reshape the culture of comms and not to leave it as an HR sort of job or a few bullets on a slide. And to do that, it's really hard to understand what it's like to be a PR professional from a BME background if that's not your own background. And so we wanted to pair people up and allow them both on a sort of personal and professional level to explore DE&I and the realities of what it's like being possibly the only person of colour in a room, what it feels like in the culture, and also to give senior leaders a chance to ask the questions maybe sometimes they feel they can't ask, but also to say, I'm thinking of initiatives, here's what I'd like to do, what do you think? And so we've run it now for 3 years. We're award winning. We won the award from BME PR Pros last year for not-for-profit, and we've had 3 cohorts go through and we've only had fantastic feedback from people. Senior leaders, I think, are quite taken aback about how personal it is, how eye-opening. They had no idea what it was like. If you haven't lived it, you don't know it. It's just as simple as that. So it's they've given us amazing feedback, and the mentors themselves have also got a lot out of it and feel that they are helping shape the industry as we go forward. So we're just literally open at the moment for people who want to apply for next year's programme. So if anybody's interested, you go to Taylor Bennett Foundation website, and we're looking for mentors and mentees. But it really is worth doing, and it really is quite a unique learning experience.
Brilliant. Well, sounds like a fantastic initiative, and good luck with the next iteration. So, moving on to the main topic of discussion, what have you both made of this inverted commas retreat from DEI, and how do you think the sort of comms has been handled by the major companies? Are there any sort of examples that stick out to you in terms of how this has been communicated in recent weeks?
Well, from my point of view, I think once you start looking at the detail, I think it's a very fundamental change that you see in the US. I mean, actually, just even looking at the language that Trump's administration has used, saying that this is DEI is illegal, it's immoral, it's wasteful, it's a scourge, it violates civil rights, it erodes national unity. I mean, he really hasn't held back on his views of what DEI is. And therefore, he's served a number of executive orders, and a number of private companies, the ones that you've mentioned already, John, they're all household names, basically, whether they're B2B or B2C, have taken these executive orders very, very seriously, and therefore either pretty much completely eliminated their DEI strategies or certainly diluted them. And I think I'm really, really surprised there hasn't been a more fundamental challenge to this. I mean, it's all happened very, very quickly, literally within a few weeks of it happening. I think the speed of it has been quite extraordinary, and especially, like I say, we're talking about household names, from the likes of Ford, Meta, Google, Disney. These are names that impact pretty much everyone, and they're global companies as well. They don't just serve an audience or the government in the US. So I think I'm surprised. My own position is I'm surprised with the speed that it's been done, that there's been a lack of challenge on it. Actually, so many of these companies have just relented at the first hurdle and said, okay, that's what we're doing. And as Avril said, from talking about the mentoring scheme that she's involved in, this is really personal. It matters to people. This is the thing that we're not talking about financial results or corporate values. I think intrinsically we have to understand that DEI matters so deeply to the people who work at an organisation, actually, and to customers they serve, even if they are B2B or B2C. So I think that's really important. I think it's left the DEI industry, if that's what you want to call it, globally in really challenging situations. And I think if you look at, for example, just recently, Deloitte has found itself in a real fixer. Deloitte in the US said it was going to roll back on its DEI targets. It was sunsetting. I think it's a terrible word to use. I think Accenture have used this word sunsetting. I think it's totally inappropriate. But actually, it's left the UK CEO of Deloitte saying, actually, no, we don't agree. We think it's really, really important to remain critical to the firm commitment to building an inclusive culture and helping people to reach their full potential. So I think, I think the upshot of this is there's going to be a split in terms of on the global companies, what the US-based companies are doing and what all other companies will do. I think that will also lead to a challenge internally in culture, but also in purpose as well. When you're talking the likes of Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example, their whole premise is based on values and purpose. So where does it lead them?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I sort of agree. I thought there would be more of a challenge. It does sort of look quite depressingly as though it was quite surface level in the first place, a lot of this stuff. It's quite hard not to come to that conclusion sometimes, which is a bit depressing, isn't it?
It is. I think, and again, just looking at the detail, because in my day job as an advisor, reputation management in terms of crisis, I inadvertently have ended up doing quite a lot in terms of internal reputation challenges. And I can absolutely say that they're increasing over time, actually. The threat is often for companies, not from outside, it is within. Again, if that's the right word, the threat. And these are not just corporate companies as such, they could be NGOs, they could be charities as well. So I think it's being felt right across all sectors, actually. But yeah, I think many employees must be feeling quite dismayed, actually, that their CEOs have, like I say, or their HR departments have relented. And I understand, again, just I think you do have to look at the detail. I think that there is a risk, and actually I imagine in terms of the HR department, the legal department, in terms of governance, in terms of what executive teams and boards, I'm sure they've all come together to make these decisions in any of these big companies and decided, actually, this is what we're going to do. But I appreciate their risk, certainly from a board or an executive level, is to weigh up the risk versus the benefit. And actually, I think it's, on the whole, quite true to say that they have placed the benefit of working with the US government in terms of the contracts they may have above the benefit to their bigger employees on a larger kind of set, or to their customers. I think they've quite clearly put, where their loyalty or their priority lies. And I think that's quite damaging for employees to kind of wonder why it's happened that way, actually. So I think I can't see anything apart from real problems with retention, real problems with recruitment for many of these companies who, quite frankly, have just been very, very overt and have had really genuinely committed real value, real purpose to their DEI targets, to their policies. They've been very overt about it. And now I think it's just been dropped so quickly that it must make you wonder, what else would they not actually do to ensure commercial viability in the future?
Yeah. Avril, what are your thoughts?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think that's touched on a really key point, that D&I actually is a benefit, whether it's to your business, to your staff and to your customers. And I think they obviously see, as you point out, working with the US government's the most important thing for them at the moment. But I would say I think it's a very polarised picture at the moment. It has happened very quickly. It's almost like knee-jerk reaction stuff, isn't it? Like, we'll get out in front and therefore we won't be attacked. But actually, there's no one view at the moment. And within a business, within a sector, even within a company, like say Deloitte US have done something totally different from Deloitte UK. In tech, we have seen Google, etc., Meta pull back, but we've seen Apple reaffirm and talk about a culture of belonging. We've seen Microsoft actually say, we want a diverse workplace because otherwise we can't create products and services for a diverse world. They're a global company. So in fact, it's not all clear cut. And I think some companies should watch and wait as they go forward now and see where we land. One thing I will say is we're not the US, or and UK business, isn't it? 85% are SMEs anyway. We're not always part of these big conglomerates. But particularly, in the US, there was two much smarter law professors than I. They've talked about lifting and leveling. So they're talking about lifting people up where you give exclusive access or you have targets and quotas and that you will give that to a particular group to address disadvantages. We actually can't do that because that would be against the Equality Act. So we've never actually done that. We've never had targets and quotas legally. And in fact, we still have to report on things like the pay gap in the UK. And then we talk about levelling, which is actually about a level playing field, about reducing bias, things like blind CVs and recruitment. So actually it's about diversity for everyone and equality for everyone and that old-fashioned phrase, equal opportunities for everyone. And in fact, that's where we've concentrated most of the work in the UK, has been about a level playing field. And diversity is actually good for all, whether you're a parent or, 51% of us are women, we count in the diversity numbers as well, or we have people who are caring responsibilities or have a disability. Everybody generally is diverse in some way or another. So we need to think about diversity as good for all and about equality. And I think that's really important. And what I think is really interesting as a sort of side piece now is the last couple of months we've seen an increase in sort of anti-American sentiment in Europe across many countries now. Have gone from sort of 15 countries, a swing from sort of 7 to -4. And I think maybe difficult times, so I won't put money on it, but maybe we will see ourselves more as Europeans and having European values around diversity and equality and fairness. I think as Brits like to think we believe in meritocracy and fairness. There'll be lots of pressures on that, but I think that's somewhere we should think about what we do.
It's a really complicated picture, isn't it, then, when you talk about positioning your company, if you are a global company that operates in all these markets. And thinking about it, there's a bit of a parallel with some of the companies around things like Pride, where there's this sort of famous thing about a lot of the sort of social media handles would change around Pride. They'd have the rainbow flag, but in some regions they don't. So in a way, there's probably a little bit of a playbook, but I don't think it's ever been quite as dramatic as this. I mean, what if you were handling comms for one of those companies that was doing this sort of DEI rollback? I mean, what sort of advice would you give, or how would you sort of approach this incredibly difficult sort of comms and reputation challenge, I suppose?
It is, I think, thing we should talk about always above all of this is, everybody's diverse in some ways, but also I think diversity is quite local. It does depend on where you are in the world. It's very regional and every region's different. So where one area might be about gender diversity, maybe in East Asia, another area might be about the British caste system or the Indian caste system. So it really depends where you're coming from. And you have to reflect that at a local level as well, because otherwise nothing resonates with what people are doing. That broader what should you do piece, I think we should reframe DE&I a little bit to really dial up things we've always talked about but maybe haven't put first, and that's about inclusivity and, like I say, equality and equality for all. I think that's really important. And I think we also should encourage our leaders and our businesses to think about repurposing D&I around the business case. Now, I notoriously say I'm not talking about the business case because I actually think it's do the right thing and there's a moral case. But where we are at the moment, if we have to pull back to the business case, and the famous McKinsey numbers that show if your board is gender diverse, you're 25% more likely to be profitable than the lowest group in that sort of measurement. And if you're ethnically diverse, you're something like 36% more likely to be profitable. You've touched on recruitment and talent, it really counts. Glassdoor did a survey a few years ago. It showed something like 76% of people think diversity is a really important factor when you're looking for a job. So, people and Gen Z, I mean, that's even more important, so it's going to get harder to attract the right talent. And it's always about the talent war and getting the right people in. And then the other thing I'd say to them is, I think, be a bit bolder and get your leadership to reaffirm that they are inclusive, because who wants to sit in a company and think that the boss doesn't give a damn about you or somehow you're not important? It's about saying, actually, it's for everybody. We're inclusive. We welcome people from all different backgrounds, and we're here to achieve something together. And we can do that within the current framework. So that's what I'd say. I'd say reframe, repurpose, and reaffirm. And we're not in the US. I get that as well. The US companies are stopping that lifting up element, which, like I say, has become illegal now, which is really weird to say that, but we never really had that in the UK, for example.
Yeah, and it's been quite interesting to see how these big companies, with all their kind of comms expertise, and they'll have huge comms departments, have handled it. So you've had everything from Zuckerberg wanting to emphasize the masculinity as well, right through to, and then is it more problematic for a female CEO, like you have at Accenture, for example, who, as a company back in 2017, they set very specific targets for having 50%, in terms of their female workforce. But actually, looking at it now, they haven't achieved that. But actually, the CEO, when it was delivered for Accenture, the news in terms of changes on their DEI policy, I think, to be honest, it was just really fudge, saying that basically we'd achieved, some kind of ambition that they had, and it's not 50%, so that hasn't been achieved. So I think in terms of comms, these things are always problematic, because I get that the comms will involve probably 100 people, not just the comms, right? So and there is, the threat, and I think just in terms of balance, I think it's important to say that the threat of not following these executive orders, these sanctions for the US are quite significant, actually. The contractors and those people that receive grants from the US federal government have been told quite explicitly that they will be penalised, for it as well. So whatever that means, will they have their government contracts taken away? Will they face some kind of legal redress? I think it's not just that you must do this. It's very much that there are steps we will take if you don't. And actually, also Trump has also, it's become quite problematic that he's kind of said, we don't want DEI in disguise, therefore don't do anything under the radar. You have to be, he's put kind of carte blanche on it at all. And I know that some company representatives have kind of wanted to show their commitment to carrying on DEI, but under the radar, and maybe that's actually what will happen. The whole point of DEI is that it should be data-driven, it should be visible, it should be open to scrutiny as well. So that leaves it in a funny place. Overall, I would say in the comms, actually, if you have a global audience, I think you have to completely acknowledge that, if it's correct, that this has been driven by what the Trump administration is saying in terms of the executive orders. And actually quite a lot of companies have been quite explicit and said that basically this is driven by legal and policy challenges within the US. I think actually this is where you also need visibility of your CEO. I mean, I think lots of memos were sent by HR departments. Actually, I think this is critically a time when the CEO should be visible, and actually that kind of all-person video presence is, you need to see the person, you need to be able to see the white of their eyes, because even though you may understand that the change in DEI is driven by a kind of a policy legislative imperative, actually it's still a time to say, do you know what, we care, you matter to us. Right, and actually, funnily enough, that's what the Google CEO did. They had an internal forum, and it was an all-staff forum, and included the CEO, and it's kind of basically the CEO said, we deeply care about hiring a workforce that represents the diversity of global users, so I think that you do need to have a balance of it, basically. So I think thinking long and hard before you communicate, because you could end up with absolutely a massively demoralised global workforce of thousands of people. So if you can nip that in the bud right from the start, I think that's the best thing to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? People always, or quite often, talk about green hushing. You wonder if we're going to get a stage of DEI hushing. Yeah,
I think that will happen inevitably. I really do. And I think it's going to be tricky, on so many levels as well, because, coming back to the UK, even though, we do have some legislation, including the 2010 Equality Act, we do have mandatory reporting on gender pay gap for employees over 250. It's kind of potentially being brought in for an ethnicity and disability as well. So we do have that. But I think, again, the impact of global companies is, how does that work on a practical level? How does it work on a comms level? How does it work on a legal or a political level as well? And these are things that I think we still have to kind of see, but you still maintain a global culture. I have no idea how you do that, actually. I think that's actually a massive challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's interesting. There's been a few episodes, and I was just looking at this earlier on, where there are some stories that have immediately been interpreted in this theme of DEI rollback, because I think it's in the media's mind that this is something happening. So in a way, the fact that it it is the zeitgeist means that things that aren't necessarily as clear cut can be interpreted that way. I'll give an example. And actually, Google, there was this story about Google removing calendar events such as Black History Month and Pride. I looked at the response to that, and what they said was they were getting requests from lots of countries to include these cultural moments. So it was sort of, quote, maintaining hundreds of moments manually and consistently globally wasn't scalable or sustainable. So in a way, maybe that wasn't necessarily in the theme of DEI rollback. Maybe that was just a practical thing they were doing. But I thought that was really interesting that people kind of jumped to that conclusion, as you would. And I think there have been other examples of this as well. So doesn't it just show that it's anything you do in a way, or there's a threat that it could be interpreted in this way? It must be very difficult.
Yeah, I think so. And I think what this also just leaves, we've seen a massive focus on purpose and values. And again, these big names, they're not immune to wanting to have purpose or values. And again, if you look, even if it's creative industries, the like of Disney, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, in some way, they're all in this kind of frame in terms of what they're going to do for their DEI policy. So I think it's also an interesting question to ask. Well, where does that leave them? Where does that leave them in terms of really pursuing their purpose, their values in the future, in terms of their campaigns, what they show, what they sell? The likes of Pepsi and Coca-Cola, and you could absolutely see that whether you want to describe it as DEI or companies like Disney being woke in terms of how they represent, films and other kind of elements of the creative industries. I think that, well, can you only practice what you preach, basically, right? So is this the kind of also not only the kind of does this not only sound the death knell inside of companies for DEI, but actually what does it mean outside to their customers, what they represent, what their values are? Because I think it's problematic, and I'm sure there'll be a way to fudge it somehow, because there's always a way of fudging it. But I think, it just really takes away from not only the kind of loyalty that their employees have engaged with them for over many, many years, but actually, consumers on a day-to-day basis. How will they now think of these big brands too?
Yeah, really good point. Avril, what do you think?
Well, I think you're right about, now we're looking through a particular lens at everything. So, and it's not just the news media or journalism, it's also just activists and stakeholders now that are going to watch companies, whether you do something, whether you don't do something. I think, you've talked about what do comms people do, but I think part of it is almost monitoring the situation and seeing who are your peer group, where's the risk coming from? If there's a risk in doing something, there's a risk in not doing something, I think, at the moment. And I think people feel immensely under pressure. The Google one's an interesting one, isn't it? The timings were, yes, very convenient in some ways. And I'm not necessarily always up for, cake and awareness days, because I do think they're a great way to just mark a moment in time, and a culture exists and it's part of our community, but I don't think it necessarily drives major change. And we should be really clear that Black History Month isn't about that. Black History Month is an acknowledgement of a long history, particularly in the States, of people who have been discriminated against and haven't been acknowledged for their contribution to society. It's not something you just loosely throw away, and just because Google don't list it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and doesn't mean we won't take a moment to mark that. And I think maybe that's where part of that value piece comes in, and whether it's washing or is it just sort of slightly lower down in terms of how much we shout about it, but internally should you be doing things around that? If your community and your customers believe in you as a diverse organisation and believe that you serve the whole of the community internally and externally, should you mark that? Now, I do think some of it in the past may have been a bit performative, not always the best way to do it, right? Suddenly companies who haven't done much, suddenly everything's got a pink ribbon on it, or what, etc., etc. But I do think it should be authentic to that company, and I do think that companies should not just think, we're not going to do it now. And I think it looked pretty petty from Google, to be honest. It's just like, really?
Yeah.
You can't put that on your calendar, it's already there.
I agree. It was a strange look. But so much of this seems to be in the nuance, doesn't it?
And the perception, right, to your point about keeping certain pieces of the American government happy and not being seen to go against them.
Yeah.
I think it's just really important to understand that there's a real need for diversity in its broadest form, right? Genuinely, I'm not talking just about ethnicity or gender. I think absolutely in its widest form, honestly, there is such a need for diversity inside organisations. And I really feel that they set the bar for lots of things, also whether they are a Goldman Sachs and therefore, as Goldman Sachs has previously put a requirement that they will only do company flotations for companies that have boards with at least one non-diverse member, and which now it seems that they've stopped. I think it's such an integral world, the world of diversity, that actually also you learn by what your peers are doing around you as well. I think it sets the bar at a particular level. And like I said, it matters to people. And I don't think you can really measure what that meaning means to people, and everyone has their own personal story, and it's very different, and it will be formulated in lots and lots of different ways. So my story may not be the same as somebody else's, but I may understand the feelings of what it's like not to feel included within a workforce or society in general. And I think those things they're hard to measure, but actually, ultimately the positive impact, the dividend of having diversity, again, like I say, at its broadest aspects in the workplace is really critical. And actually, there was a big EY report. I think the most current report that we've had in the UK in terms of benefits of diversity was from EY just at the start of this year. And it just reiterates what the McKinsey report has said. It's good for productivity, it's good for morale, it's good for, the bottom line, it's good for innovation, it's good for the ability to be flexible as well. It has so many assets that it's not just about a woke agenda, it really has benefits. And I do feel that having diverse workforces are crucial to society as a whole.
And I support that wholeheartedly. I just think diversity delivers on so many aspects of business. And I know we're talking about broader businesses, but even from a comms industry perspective, we can see how can we reach all these different audiences and communities if we have nobody in our team that has any understanding of them, of what their, priorities are, where they get their information from, what their culture is like at home, what's important to them in terms of how they live their lives. And, we're just a microcosm of that. If we don't diversify, we can't do our job well. We can't reach the people we're supposed to be reaching, and we can't do it in an authentic way. So, the fact you talked about companies, nearly 40% of UK boards are still purely white, whereas actually if you look at the numbers now, it's nearly 1 in 5 people in the UK come from an ethnically diverse background or have a mixed heritage. So how can that be reflective of society and what society wants to see happen?
Yeah. I mean, we sort of touched on it, but these kind of cultural moments coming up, I mean, a lot of people listening to this might be planning sort of pride activities, maybe discussing it with their clients, their in-house teams. I mean, do you sort of expect there to be a kind of real withdrawal of activity around things like pride? And before that, we've got International Women's Day in a few weeks. And obviously Black History Month in the UK is coming up later this year. And there are others we could mention too. I mean, what do you think is going to happen here? And what do you think, I guess, should happen if you're involved in comms and thinking about getting involved in these sorts of events?
I think it's always helpful to have those kind of calendar moments, the diary moments of the year to allow people to think. I always believe that it should come back to the core of what an organisation or a company represents, basically. And it's not necessarily just about celebrating specific days in the calendar. I think DEI has to have integrity. It has to have, funny enough, longevity. It's not something I feel that can kind of police itself or regulate itself. I think left to its own devices, we know historically, it just doesn't do it automatically. And actually, I think for me, one of the most disappointing things has been in the comms so far is actually those business leaders that have said, actually, we don't need this anymore because we feel like we've got to where we are. And actually, I think if you believe that, I think you're rather deluded, to be honest. And I think you see things from a very specific perspective. And quite frankly, I don't believe it's correct. So I think, overall, carry on with marking those specific events if you feel that helps, but don't feel like it's just a plaster on your ability to have integrity within your organisation. Because I think, again, if you want sincere long-term employee engagement, they're going to be able to see through all of that. Okay, from the inside, they will know what the feeling, what the sentiment is. They will know what the policies are. How are they being committed to as well? So, I think it's very easy to feel like you've got everyone's attention because you're doing certain things at certain times of the year. But actually, I think the key thing is really, have you got the back of your employees, basically? Do they feel that there's integrity in what you do? And it's not always possible to get things right. I understand that. But again, I think, do you know what? Genuinely explaining to people why you've taken a certain position just really helps. And I think having clarity and in the messaging in the DEI Trump era has become really, really crucial. I think it's the content, it's the tone, it's the format of your messaging that really, really matters. And I genuinely believe that your staff will have more empathy for you if you are brave enough, you are courageous enough to face them and take those difficult questions and take time to explain, rather than just quietly diluting your DEI, taking the DEI website off, removing those from your annual reports. Why would you have respect for an employer that does that, basically? So I think, do you know what? A certain level of transparency is really critical in all of this as well.
Again, quite a lot of people listen to this, their employers may be rolling back these policies, and it's their job to communicate it, or at least to deal with inquiries about it from the press and elsewhere. So you think you're better off just putting it out there, getting it over with, just being transparent about it, and then moving on, rather than, as you say, there's a sort of danger of, if people do it on the sly, and then there might be stories that come out later on and they kind of look a bit worse, maybe.
There may be, but and then this is where the kind of nuance that we talked about before. I mean, I think in the US, I think we are already going to see kind of legal challenges to what the Trump administration has brought in, okay? And they're coming from DEI circles. I had a look, and actually it looks like that there probably will be. And I'm it's good that there will be that challenge. At least it will be tested through the court process, rather than an edict coming down and has, quite significant implications. So yes, it's difficult to do, isn't it? Because you have to always work on the basis, as many of these internal memos, or even if they're videos, get shared with the outside world, okay? You have to take it as read that that's what's going to happen. But I think what's important, certainly from a US point of view, is not to pretend, because I think the numbers show this has all been driven by what these executive orders have said, okay, and the fear of losing contracts. To pretend otherwise with the timing, I kind of think just feels really fraudulent and very, very insincere, and I'm sure your staff will see through all of that. So I have more respect for those companies that have said this is directly impacted because of what has been uttered by the president. And like I say, they were very, very strong words that he used, that they're morally illegal, they're the scourge of national unity. These are strong words. I understand that, but I think that using words like sunsetting, using phrases like we've already, on the whole, achieved what we wanted to do, are really not helpful. So it's better to, I feel it's better to be clear and say, look, we're in this situation, the regulation and the kind of politics of it all kind of say that this is what we have to do. And actually, but just balance that by saying, something to the words that we care about diversity, we care about you. I think those kinds of words really matter. They're important for your staff to hear those.
Yeah. Absolutely. Avril, any thoughts on that difficult communications
challenge? Yes. I mean, I think in the States you haven't... Well, firstly, I think you should take your time. I don't think you should necessarily rush out. I think knee-jerk decisions are not always the best decisions. But I do appreciate that, if you've got a lot of government contracts, you are facing a very difficult decision what to do. And I do think then you should be authentic and should say what the facts are and why you're doing something, and be very clear to all your stakeholders, because your stakeholders are going to watch you, as we said earlier, but so are other people. You're under scrutiny now, and if you're not honest about why you're doing something, it will come back and bite you, and you should be very clear why you had to make those decisions, but equally what things you still believe in and what you're going to continue doing. And like I say, the rest of us aren't the US, and I think the US is in a very particular situation, and the rest of the world, culturally, D&I based, legally, have got very different needs and pressures to meet. And I think, where you can, you should support what you're doing around diversity. And like I say, inclusion, if we want to change the language, it's about inclusion for everybody. And it's about making an equal opportunity workplace. That really does feel like old language, but that's what we used to talk about. And that's what we strove to achieve, and what we still strive at the moment in the UK and in Europe to offer people, that nobody should come to the door and be judged on what they look like or what their background is or what their sexuality is or whether, God forbid, they're female. We expect people to be treated fairly, and I think we should support that in what we do, and we should be honest about doing those things. And your point about, calendar moments, you can still do those, but, I always challenge, like I say, the performative aspect of those. Isn't it better if it's Black History Month to try and find some more black suppliers to go on your supplier list, or, choose to support a black business at that point, rather than just thinking you can put out an email with some nice pictures on it and a little bit, a box on a little bit of history. Let's try and, if we're going to live it, let's try and live it properly now, because people will be looking internally and externally at what you're doing. You can do that in an authentic way. You can do that in a way that doesn't challenge everything that's going on in the States. So you can find your own path that lives well within your own culture, with your own stakeholders, and is totally, acceptable, and what people are expecting of you. And I think you made that point earlier, Zaiba, that actually, if you just do an about face, people are going to question who you are, and it's going to come back later, and people are going to ask you, but didn't you go to that inauguration? Didn't you change your mind after that? People are questioning now, these firms, about who they really are and what will they do for the next dollar, rather than are they ever going to do the right thing, or for their stakeholders.
Yeah.
And I think just in the UK, we are in a very different place. I mean, obviously politically, in terms of the regulation, in terms of with what Labour are kind of heading towards, in terms of what happens in the workplace. So I think we don't certainly have this challenge here in the UK as they do in the US. I think that the problem is for global companies how they basically don't have a complete disconnect internally or externally in terms of what's happening there and what's happening here. And that's a challenge. But, it will take some brains to work that out. And I don't think it can be reconciled somehow. It will just take a bit of time to think about how doing it. But fundamentally, the kind of the landscape that we have here at the UK is still very pro DEI. So there's no reason why organisations, large or small, shouldn't carry on and commit to having DEI with integrity, with longevity. And that, it, like you said, Avril, is inclusive as well. So yes, I think from a UK point, it should, we have a much more positive picture, and I think that's really important to recognise.
Yeah. Final question. I mean, we talk a lot about the role of PR and comms in the C-suite, how influential the industry is to the sort of decision makers in businesses. With that in mind, what do you think comms, if anything, can do to actually influence these policies, and whether they happen at all? I mean, do you think, is it too much to say that comms should be part of the discussion about whether these policies happen and how they're communicated, but whether they exist at all? What do you think?
I think we should be in the room, and I think we should very clearly discuss with the C-suite what the risks are of doing what we're doing, what we're not doing, what our peers are doing, how the environment is shaping up, what are the activists saying. We're going to be monitored in what we do, and so that's our role, is to help that awareness of what, in this dynamic environment, of what is going on, and understanding of, like I say, the stakeholders, and whether they're internal or external. We should be part of that channel to feed that back in. But if I'm really honest, I think it's very limited what comms people can do when you're faced with losing your American government contracts, in the face of a political system and a culture that's done an about face and feels very different from what it used to feel like. Again, we can guide, we can talk about risk, we can help manage, we can prepare, we look at our, both allies and advocates, but also detractors, we can think about that and how we do collaborations and how we work together with different people across, whether it's a sector or a business, etc. And we can make sure people are aligned around, and to that point we talked about earlier, understand why we're doing things. But I don't think it's very hard for a comms person per se to change a CEO's mind when they're being buffeted by so many forces, particularly in the US, and so many different voices. I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, I agree. I think when you have those what may seem as very kind of specific parameters to operate in, this, you're quite limited in what you can do. I think then it really is down to internal and external comms to work out what the messaging looks like, what the tone looks like. But I think where those parameters don't exist, so again, maybe bringing it back to the UK or lots of other countries, I think there's absolutely, there's scope to understand these things often come in moods, don't they? And they fluctuate as well. So I think it's always a good idea to understand what some of the kind of developing issues are. I mean, DEI is not something that stands still. It changes, and if there's potentially, for example, I suppose one area would be if there is at some point going to be compulsory reporting on ethnicity pay gap. Just thinking comms can play a part. Just thinking, well, what does that look like? How do we present that information? What do we do? So understanding what kind of things are on the cusp or coming up, I think, is always a good way for comms to feed back into the C-suite, right? Seeing this is exactly that. We're seeing what our peers are doing. We're seeing how the kind of DEI landscape or industry is developing. It's a move towards this. I think preempting some of that can influence back into the C-suite when the C-suite may not have the bandwidth to be able to kind of look at these things and preempt, because then it can potentially inform, their policy and their drive and their ambition internally as well.
Of course, we're only one aspect of, the whole anti-woke piece, right? There's all things about, net zero, there's things about, aid and things like that. And we can see with this administration that there could be something else on the agenda probably tomorrow morning. Every time we wake up in the morning and check your social media and your news, like what's happened, it could swing, maybe it won't swing towards DEI, but it could certainly shift its focus to another area that then becomes, critical to the agenda and what they want to talk about. And suddenly we slide down the agenda a bit. You just don't know. It's so dynamic.
And it also begs the question, once the time runs out on the Trump administration and there's another administration, what happens there? Are we going to have companies that are beholden to complete U-turns on DEI and various other policies? You can see that happening, but actually, it completely dilutes anything that they stand for. And it's quite a difficult longer term for them to view as well. I think the longer term for these organisations is really problematic on DEI now. There's a limited amount of time in terms of the presidency, but beyond that, what happens? How open are you with your language? Do you do, a complete reversal at some point? And therefore, do you have like 4 or 5 year periods of DEI in, out, in, out, in, out? It becomes really, really problematic. So I think also that they need to think about how they deal with that challenge, what longevity is there without having to completely reformulate what they stand for and what their purpose is inside and outside as well.
Absolutely. Well, huge challenges ahead. I think we can all agree on that. But I'd love to discuss this more, but we're running out of time for today's episode. So Avril, Zaiba, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your insights. And thank you to everyone for listening. We'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access the PR Week Beyond the Noise podcast. So until next time, goodbye.